This week is about putting it all together. So we've started from a question of what is evidence-based practice. We talked about that during the first couple of weeks. And then we systematically move through the elements of research articles, both from a quantitative and from a qualitative perspective, with an idea to be able to pull apart those specific little pieces, whether it's what is the sampling design? Do they use a convenient sample, people that just show up to clinics, or are they randomly sampling from a population? We talked about study designs, the importance of having a control group to compare to your experimental group so that in case something else is happening, whether it's regression to the mean or maturation or those others threat to internal validity that we identified, that we've designed a study that enables us to ask the question about whether the independent and the dependent variable, the relationship between those, is causally linked or is something else going on. We talked about measurement of variables. We talked about the ways in which qualitative research can get at the underlying experience of clients or peoples or systems while recognizing the subjective nature of reality and how we then pull apart those textual elements and put them back together. And we talked a lot about p-values and statistical significance and identified a few key statistical tests, t-tests, chi-squared, correlations, and regression as sort of the basic level of statistical knowledge. This week we're going to talk about how you take all of those elements and put them together and think about them holistically. Because the real issue for us in this class is not teaching you to be a researcher, or the importance isn't in identifying the different forms of reliability or threats to internal validity. The idea behind this class and what we want you to get out of it is to be able to read a research article, know what the important elements are, use your clinical knowledge, integrate it with the findings from the study, and then be able to critically appraise the quality of that evidence and its usefulness to your clients. And that end jump of usefulness to your clients is what we're going to talk about today. So I want to go back in time a little bit and revisit this idea of evidence-based practice. And if you remember, we talked about evidence-based practice as two separate things. First of all, evidence-based practice is a process, and that's the process that we've been systematically going through in this class. And we're going to talk about that more in just a second. The second element is evidence-based practice as a stamp of approval. There are certain interventions that have been identified as evidence-based practices: assertive community treatment, cognitive behavioral therapy, supportive housing, supported employment. These are things that have a large body of evidence that support their use in clinical settings and their effectiveness for outcomes that clients care about. Now, how we evaluate that and get to that process, get to that end result, is this process element of evidence-based practice. There's an underlying model that we use to conceptualize this process, and we'll go through the steps of the process again, which should be very familiar to you by now. But I also wanted to return to this image over here and think about what it actually means. When we have evidence in front of us, the evidence is usually not exactly about the population we're studying. The articles are not generally about our clinic or necessarily even our sample. We might be working with people that are slightly different, that have different needs, that have different preferences, that are in different geographic areas, that have different ailments, that have different primary problems. And so how do we get from the evidence that actually exists to our clients? And that's what this model is about. Because evidence-based practice, the model of using evidence in practice, basing your practice on evidence, involves not only the evidence, identifying the evidence, critically appraising the evidence, assessing the evidence, but also integrating your clinical judgment and how you think about your clients, what you think is important to do with your clients and work with your clients. You're going to gain a whole bunch of clinical knowledge, and that clinical knowledge is essential for understanding and contextualizing the evidence that you now have learned how to critically appraise. There's another element to this as well, which is our clients' preferences. Because one of the things that is really important to think about when critically appraising articles is, do the outcomes that are measured in the article that suggest intervention X is effective, are those the outcomes that matter to your client? And we're going to talk about that too today. So let's jump into some of these larger ways of thinking about and putting together all of the critical elements that we've been talking about in this class. So there's a few things in the worksheets that you're going to go through for the worksheet assignment really focus you on some of these specific elements. Things like, how big is the sample? Is the sample appropriate enough to make inferences from? If you want to talk about the people in a clinic, if you have half the people in the clinic, even if the clinic only has 100 people and you have 50 people, that's a very large relative sample, and you probably can figure out what's going on with the clinic if they've sampled with any reasonable sampling strategy from a population of 100 to a sample of 50. But if you are asking a question about the United States and you've only sampled 50 people, that's probably not enough to get the range of thoughts or opinions or outcomes or whatever it is that you're interested in for 300 and some odd million people with 50 people. So the relative sample, the sample size and the importance of sample size is one of these things where there's relative judgment. And we've focused you in on some of those questions on the worksheet. But how you think about that, how you decide, how you think about that, and whether you think the sample size is appropriate or not depends on the context on which it's being used. And that's the element that's not about the specifics of the number. It's about you taking a step back and thinking about the research, the study that you're evaluating in the context of both what you want to know and in the context of what their specific questions are. Now, in evaluating that, there's several things that you should think about. First of all, who's asking the question? Most of the time, some researcher is asking the question. If they're asking the question about an intervention that they've developed, then there's a source of bias right there that you can identify. Somebody that has been promoting and thinking and staking their career on the success of an intervention is going to be more biased in favor of finding positive outcomes than some neutral observer. And we see this a lot with drug studies, where if you look at the evidence for things like antidepressives or even antipsychotic medications, which can be effective in certain contexts, the evidence for their effectiveness is overblown because a lot of the studies were paid for by pharma money. And of course, if you're working for pharma, you're going to find that your drug is successful. You're going to set up the question to be successful. So asking who is paying for the study, who is doing the study, who's developing the questions are a good place to start to think about whether the evidence is going to be subject to a lot of bias or a rather minimal amount of bias. Who's making decisions about what is appropriate evidence? And often this is in most of the studies, and so I think all of the worksheet studies, some researcher has decided what the important outcome is. But you don't have to buy that. You don't have to say that this reduction in symptoms is the most important outcome. Clients may be less concerned about symptoms. So if you look at research on schizophrenia, for example, we clinicians, we drug companies, we people doing interventions are really focused on reducing psychiatric symptoms. But if you go and you talk to clients, what's important to them, I mean, the symptoms are not unimportant, but what's really important is having relationships and having social interaction with people and having meaningful relationships. And I keep repeating relationships thing because that's what most people want is actual relationships. Meaningful activities in life, work and employment and things like that. Things that are just what all human beings want, or most human beings want. And so we may focus as researchers on symptom reduction, whereas the clients are much more interested in outcomes relevant to their quality of life. And so when we are critically appraising an article, we want to be able to think clearly about whether the outcome is just an outcome that's relevant to researchers or to drug companies because the FDA requires it, or is it because, you know, the funder of the study is really interested in some particular outcome, or is this an outcome of interest to clients? And another broad critique that I think is important, and it's something that I've really focused on in this course, is p-values and statistical significance should not be confused with clinical significance. The idea that there is a difference that is not explained by randomness between an independent and a dependent variable, or two states of a dependent variable, is neither here nor there. if that difference isn't meaningful. So p-values are one threshold that are important to cross, and I'm not minimizing that. But if, for example, if you find a p-value of 0.1, which is above our cutoff of 0.05, then that suggests that this difference is indistinguishable from randomness in a way that we shouldn't necessarily link the independent and the dependent variable. But if it does cross that threshold, that's just the first step. The second step is for you to use clinical judgment and ask, is this an important difference? So I'm working on a project where we're evaluating length of stay in hospitals, and I was trying to think of like what's a good important difference between two groups in terms of length of stay, and length of stay is measured in days. And so I thought, all right, so when the last time I was in a hospital for a personal reason, my wife and I had a baby. She actually had the baby. I was just there while she had the baby, and we had 2 days stay in the hospital. And I thought, okay, if we had a third day, that would have been a meaningful thing. If a third day would have actually cost a lot of money, but it would have allowed us to have another day with my little son Gus in a nursery where we could get some sleep. We might have been able to do some more work around breastfeeding or whatever else the nurses might have helped us with. So a day would have been a meaningful unit there. So when I go back to my study, which is about days in the hospital for schizophrenia, I thought, okay, so I'm going to call a day a meaningful thing. Now, you'll see there, none of that involved statistical reasoning. None of that involved any form of external objective kind of assessment. It was a subjective assessment of what do I think is important and can I defend that? And that's the kind of critical thinking that you guys can engage in using your clinical knowledge and your personal knowledge of what's important. So again, p-value tells you whether it's different from randomness. Clinical significance and effect sizes tell you whether these things are meaningful, and that's something that you can have a really good grasp on and use your own clinical knowledge to inform.